Some of the people we've worked with have been able to have amazingly different lives by exiting really high value clinics at the right time and just living the lives that they've always dreamed of, spending 3 months abroad, all sorts of things that are really cool things that most owners and most doctors wouldn't dream of. They've been able to manifest / facilitate because they've said yes to this, and it's just freed them up.
Most people sell their practice at the wrong time and for too little. And so today we're going to cover that and how to maximize your returns. Welcome back to the Scale My Clinic podcast. I'm here with Todd. Hey, welcome, Todd.
Sachin, hey.
So today we're talking exit. We might start with, what's the first consideration when it comes to selling? I'm thinking it's probably something around the reasons for sale. Maybe talk to us about that to start us off.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first question to ask is, why would I entertain selling? Sometimes it's an idea that the owner or owners group themselves have the idea to sell, and other times it's an external offer that precipitates the conversation. I had a call like this yesterday from someone I know really well from general practice land that said, hey, we've had somebody call and offer to buy the practice. We haven't thought about that. What should I do? This is a relatively common thing. I think there's probably three key things in this section that are worth thinking about. The timing for you, and there's a broader question around timing for tax effectiveness and also life timing. My experience in dealing with many sales and purchases on the buying side is that most people sell too late in life. And I'm going to get to a resource. People can have a read about this in a moment. Then there is what I talked about earlier, the tax effectiveness. There might be rollover opportunities, might be opportunities to put money into super. There could be a lot of other things that drive the decision to sell. And I want to be really clear that there is also the possibility of selling to yourself. So this is not necessarily something that is selling to an external party. I won't talk too much about that extra. And then there might be a trigger. Sometimes a trigger is around a change in health. It could be a psychological change that's not as severe as severe mental illness. It might just be you're no longer up for it, no longer interested in that. Burnout is a real issue as part of that. And sometimes relationships. Your partner might say, you know what, it's either you or it's either the business or me, or it might be that the practice has to be liquidated as part of separating assets. Those are sort of common drivers around this. That resource section, you've read it, I've read it. One of my favorite books, Die with Zero by Bill Perkins. The real gift here is Die with Zero always makes people think that you're going to cark it and have 0 cents left in your account. And that's the tag, that's the headline, but it's not the tagline. The tagline I checked on, and it says, getting all you can from your money and your life. And that's the real story in this book. I'm going to throw back to you. What were the takeaways for you when you read that book section?
Yeah, I think probably the part that stood out is that there are different phases of life. And in that book, different phases of life, you are going to have different experiences that you can have. But once that time's gone, you're not going to, if you miss that experience, your later enjoyment of the experience won't be the same as that. One of the key concepts is you don't die once, you die multiple times. So different versions of you die through your life. And so, classic is we may have traveled a bit rough in our 20s, but had amazing memories from that. And those memories pay recurring dividends. However, in your 40s or 50s, if you did the same sort of slightly rough or edgy trip, you're just not going to have the enjoyment because it's a different you. So that was one of the key things. The other one was that we often overestimate how much we'll need. And so we run out of life before we run out of money. And so there's some really clever ways of thinking about how we sort of keep the two in step throughout our life, and how we make sure that we create plenty of memories, which pay memory dividends, he calls them, throughout. So those were some of the biggest things that stood out for me. How about you?
Yeah, I love the concept of most people have their bucket list. And he said, well, actually, like you were just alluding to, it's not a bucket list, they're time buckets. And so, you can only go and hike Machu Picchu in a certain age bracket. You only go and backpack Europe in a certain age bracket, you can only go and, there's all sorts of things that your physical limitations may well be a big part of. The other thing that I thought was really interesting in this book was they talk about the average age of inheritance in the US as being 68 is what he talks about. I looked it up. In Australia, it's 55 to 59. And inheritance is not what we're talking about here, but it's often the time that people think about selling practices. And so the reality is that you're getting money at a time in your life that often has much lower impact. And so I'll give you some examples of this session where we've had people either sell practices externally or sell them to themselves and pay down their mortgages and be mortgage free in their early 40s and sometimes 30s, ages where you wouldn't normally assume that you would be free of non-deductible debt. And so they're really cool outcomes. And then, of course, being able to impact and help your kids, maybe your parents, depending on what their circumstances are, or siblings, or even just whatever charitable organization that you prefer to support, you're in a much better capacity to be able to support them. He also talks about this thing that we're programmed to do. I have this conversation with my mum all the time. I manage her super. She completely leaves it alone until she says she wants money and then starts talking about what she can take out of there. But we get programmed through our whole life to be in accumulation phase, to be saving money. And then we never really flip it to drawdown. You're saving it, and then it becomes, I'm saving it for myself. It becomes to, I'm saving it for my kids. But really, this book talks about turning that money into experiences. So your job is to turn those funds into experiences for you and your loved ones. And that is where you really get the value out of life. And you can meet people like this that have kind of sucked the marrow out of life, had a great time. Other people that are miserable as all hell, we've got a heap of money in the bank, is never investing in anything worth doing. And so that was what I found most useful in that. Strongly recommend that book, Die with Zero, Bill Perkins.
Excellent. And there was one other thing that I think that could be a reason for sale that you didn't cover that you were just talking about. I'll share. So it was a few years back, I was a few years into my journey as an owner. We went through, there's just a little bit of a big cultural issue at my practice, and 3 team members that were a little cabal, and it felt like a them and us situation. I just remember one day they cornered me somewhere, and really it was pretty brutal what they were saying to me, blaming me for something that was actually their accountability, nothing to do with me. It was around accreditation. And I remember speaking to my business partner, and we just decided we're out. And so there we are. We booked in the business broker, Larry, in the appointment book, but put as insurance broker. And he came to see us one evening, and there it said, "Oh, I've got a buyer, non-medical. They'll buy it from you. Not for not a great deal that they would have paid." And I remember just being ready to run away. We knew it was worth more. We knew there was more potential, but we just were fed up and wanted out. That's the reason, right? Some people just are fed up and they just want to escape.
I think that's a common one, Sachin, and it comes in 2 varieties. One is where people have real businesses, like what you're talking about, and they're either disheartened, downtrodden. That's kind of, to my mind, it comes down to the psychological area, and that there's a distortion of the reality. And you hear people selling properties because of bad tenants, and it's in that kind of vein where you come to believe something that is only partially true, not fully true. And then the other ones are those that deluded. So people that have not really run good businesses, probably shouldn't have ever started them, and they never get above 1 or 2 doctors, and they kind of believe that somebody will buy them out. They kind of have this white knight fantasy that somebody's going to come and pay a fortune for the business. You and I have talked about this in a prior episode, but occasionally what happens is the professionals, the accountants and their lenders, the accountant verifies the transaction, says it's worth it when it isn't. And the bank says, yeah, we'll give you the money because the banks know that they can always get a clinician to go to work. And lo and behold, somebody buys this stud. The people on the other side are just believing in a white knight, that somebody's going to come and take this business from them that they hate, that they would rather do anything than go to that workplace. That's the other one where people kind of think this magical thing will happen.
Cool. Just in case anyone's interested, we did not run away. We lent back in and took it on. All right. So that's the first question was, why selling? What's the next thing that people should be thinking?
Then beyond that, once the question's been asked, I think it's useful to ask yourself, am I ready to sell? There are kind of factual and logical parts to that. The other parts of it are emotional. And so when I was talking to this person who rang me and said, hey, we've had this offer. They part own a couple of clinics. And one of my questions was their attachment. How much are they connected to the clinics? I think we can often see them as an extension of ourselves and somewhat like children. And so, there is a genuine loss when, and there's grief that goes with that when something that you've poured so much of your heart and soul into goes. And so I think there's a bit to be done on the psychological side to make sure that you're ready to sell. And one question I think that's really valuable to ask yourself, and ask yourself this honestly, is would I buy my clinic? Whatever the answer is to that question, if there's conditions on the answer, it says only if, only if, only if, you need to keep those in mind as things that you need to improve. And I can't remember who said this to me, Sachin, but it was one of those wise bits of feedback in the coaching environment you and I are in, receiving coaching. And they said, you're always selling your business. Most commonly it's to your future self, but sometimes it is to somebody else. And so you always need to think about your business being for sale because it should be for sale to you. And there's a really good quote from Andy Grove, who's the Intel legend. He was at Intel for 37 years, no longer with us, but a management guru that saw them from the early days when they were just one of the semiconductor producers to being the global empire that it is today in chip production. And his question was, what would my replacement do? This is what he used to do when he was stuck with a strategic decision. I think it's actually a really good question to ask yourself when you're thinking of selling a clinic. What would my replacement do? What would the future owner of this business do? And there'll be a ton of things that come out of that. That becomes the checklist of things that you probably should have on your list of things to do prior to selling.
Cool. And that's quite useful because you're really putting yourself in an empowered frame of mind and you're looking at it with new eyes and thinking, well, if I was new to this, what would I tackle first? And then what things would I improve? All right. So I've decided why I'm selling. Now I'm asking myself, why am I ready or am I ready? And then I've decided, there's quite a few bits here that I wouldn't want to buy, and that probably need improvement. So what's next? What should people be thinking about next?
Look, if you've got the time, and so there are some groups of people that through health in particular or relationship breakdown where they need to exit the business entity, they may need to make a sudden decision. And the advice I'm giving here should be taken by everybody, because if you have 18 to 24 months to improve the value of the business, you can extract a lot of gold from the business that is there as a dividend for you to take, but it's an efficiency dividend. You've got to do the work before you collect it. If you hand it over and you leave too much money on the table, then you're just going to see the person in future that collects on the value that you took often decades to build up. And there's a case study at the end I like to share about somebody who has done this particularly well in just 2 years, which is why I think 18 to 24 months should be the amount of time that people lock down as a commitment towards doing this. And then if you've got that amount of time, Sachin, the order of things that I would approach is all of the levers you can pull to increase revenue. And I won't go into what all of those are. Some of them are really obvious, some are less obvious, but driving revenue. Then what we need to do is do our best to reduce the overheads and improve the efficiency of the business in terms of the return. And we do that through a variety of means, but obviously having our audit of all of the expenses, making sure that what we are paying for, we're using and that we're getting appropriate return on those, making sure that our staffing levels are appropriate for the clinic and that we have great staff that are really well paid. That would probably include having offsite teams as well as part of that to make sure that you're optimizing for on-site service efficiency and taking some of those things offsite. You need to optimize for space utilization. So sometimes people give over premium rooms to low-paying tenants, and I would include allied health in there in most cases. If you can have a GP in a room rather than allied health, you might have pathology taking up more space than is required. You might have oversized treatment rooms that aren't being fully utilized. Just having some of an eye towards really efficient allocation of floor space. Every square meter needs to earn its living in the business. You need to make sure that you get the team fully aligned. That's going to involve role clarity, active alignment sessions, and making sure that the accountabilities, the dashboards, the scorecards, all of those things are kept front and center. And so the daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, all the cadence of scorecards and dashboards that you and I would coach with our Project X members, installing all of those. We call it a human operating system, making sure that's running really efficiently. And then all the business process efficiency work around processes and optimizing those. They're probably the things that I would be focusing on. And you can expect a massive uplift in value just from getting all of those things right.
So that gives us an idea of the order in which you might tackle improvement. There's probably something to add, Todd, which is, why would you do that improvement just as you want to get out? Obviously, there is that, is it the apple tree quote, or, the best time to plant a oak tree maybe was
10 years ago.
20 years ago, or whatever. The second best time is today. There'll be people who are listening or watching this who are earlier on in their journey. I think it's really important that people think about this, that this is not work. If you can bring it to now and you're not planning to exit for 10, 20, 30 years, it's still worth doing as soon as possible, because then you get the recurring benefit of that work over a multitude of years.
Yeah, absolutely. So you get the benefit now in that you'll get more income, and therefore you get a multiplier on that income at exit of typically between 3 and 5 times. If it's a medium to large clinic, it's closer to 5 times the profit. And so whatever dollar you create in profitability, you get somewhere between $3 and $5 back. The question that was asked of me from this person that called me recently was, they're not that far away from retirement. They said, yeah, if I improve it and it's going well, why would I sell it? And I said, well, in the end, you're not the end owner of anything. We're all stewards for whatever we have, all of our possessions. And so some of us know when that time is. And I'm going to get to a sporting analogy, and just the greats that leave any game at a time when people think, gee, I really wish they stuck around. Adam Gilchrist sticks in my mind as a leaver that did it at the right time. I think there's a right time to leave businesses, which does depend a lot on the individual. One of the challenges for clinics is they've got multiple owners with different ages, different contributions, and different life journeys. Then it's going to be difficult to find something that meets everybody's needs. But that's okay if you get a mechanism to have people buy and sell internally in the ownership group that works, or you could sell the whole thing. In fact, this call I had with this friend of mine, I said, well, there are 4 options. The first option is you all sell. The second option is that amongst the ownership group, they had 4 owners. Some of you sell, and then on the other side of it, some of you buy. So you reduce the number of unit holders. And the last one is that none of you sell. They're the 4 options available to you. And if none of you sell, it's really just none of you sell now, because eventually you have to sell for whatever reason. And so I think it comes back to the timing and what I talked about earlier, the tax preferential treatment, where it fits into your life. Some of the people we've worked with, Sachin, have been able to have amazingly different lives by exiting really high value clinics at the right time, and just living the lives that they've always dreamed of, spending 3 months abroad, all sorts of things that are really cool things that most owners and most doctors wouldn't dream of. They've been able to manifest / facilitate because they've said yes to this, and it's just freed them up. I think it sounds like a really strange thing to say, but having exited a position in anything and having money in your hand does change your mindset on a lot of things. You do have choice. You could do it again. Once you know what you're doing, you could do it more quickly. You might have an alternative investment you want to get into, or an alternative strategy. Or you might choose to keep it, which is completely okay when you've improved it. And so therefore, I think that 18 to 24 month idea is there for everybody who owns a practice, because if you've got 2 years, you can really lean into the clinic and elevate the performance. And then you choose not to sell because it's doing so well. Hey, that's okay too.
Absolutely. All right. There's a question on everyone's minds that's watching this or listening to this, which is around the money.
The money.
Show me the money. Show me the money. That's it. Before we get to that point, or we can do it a bit later, you tell me. I think there's one big elephant in the room to probably discuss. You touched on it earlier, and I'm going to throw it out there because it's something that I speak to a lot of owners now coming to me, and a lot of prospective purchasers talking to me. And when it comes to price, there are a number of smaller operators, often only themselves, maybe one other GP, maybe 2 other GPs, who frankly have a deluded sense of the value of their business. And I think it's just really important to call it out and say it quite clearly. That the latest was, I spoke to someone a couple of days ago. There are 4 GPs in the practice, and they're asking for the business 2.5 million. The profit they're quoting is 800,000. It's just not happening. I've seen enough to know that. That's just really common. I just see it all the time. You'll see people who are buying a 2 GP practice and are paying 1.3 million like that. That's just very common that those things happen. We will cover that, but I just want to make sure that I've stated very clearly that if you are looking to sell your practice and there's like 2 other doctors and you're selling the business separate to the real estate, it is highly, highly, highly unlikely that is worth 7 figures. Like, massively unlikely.
100%. Let's address this. I think it's a really important thing. The first thing is, I'm not going to blame the people who try to sell overinflated assets. There's just people that you can't trust that are out there. And if you think the obligation of the vendor is to look after you as a buyer, you probably need to be slapped around and have the realities of the world explained to you. Look, if you go and buy a used car and you expect the person to be honest with you about all of the problems that have gone on with the car, then again, you're probably dreaming. So buying a business is less safe than a used car in many cases. So I'm going to say this again. Do not choose amateurs. I don't care if your best mate is an accountant and they're a general accountant and they're Jim from around the corner, or you went to school with them. I do not care. You must have a professional advisor. You must have a professional accountant, and you must have an industry professional legal expert. There is just no 2 ways about this. There are 2 names that I use regularly. It's William Buck and Growth MD. Those 2 businesses are awesome for this. You will not be led astray if you're using them to audit the accounts of the business that you're looking at buying. If you have not put aside money for due diligence, then frankly, you deserve to get screwed. And if you're thinking, how much money do I need? You probably need 20 to 30 grand per clinic if you're going to look at it. Now, your job is to get smarter and smarter and smarter over time and reduce how much money you're spending on that. Because if you get smarter, then you have to rely less on the lawyers and less on the accountants. But if you don't have a budget for due diligence and you're just going to go and spend $1 million on something that's probably worth 150 grand, well, guess what? Your next decade is paying back that extra 110 grand per year of interest that is worth exactly 0. I mean, Sachin, I've got a guy that comes to mind that bought 2 clinics with properties attached that were worth probably half of what was paid, maybe less. And I'm going to be really completely brutally honest here, is this person has 15 to 20 years of their life working their ass off, weekends and evenings, very little holidays, for probably 12 to 15 years to pay this back. Because we're talking about 100 to 150K a year of excess payments above value. So imagine that you had to pay 120 to 150 grand a year extra tax, and it is a tax. It's called the dumb tax. So don't pay the dumb tax. Do not sacrifice yourself at the altar of somebody else's false prophecy. These are clinics that are absolutely worth a lot less than what they're trying to sell them for. Don't do it. That's going to put you in a lot of pain. The one thing that pisses off Sachin and I more than anything else is clinic owners being taken to the cleaners. I don't give a stuff about anyone else in the health system, just general practice owners. The rest of them can fend for themselves or have their own spokespeople. We are here for general practice owners. If anybody screws them, you have to go through Sachin and I.
Absolutely. And so on the flip side of that, if you're a vendor of one of those practices, you're looking to sell it, you could have been misadvised or given incorrect information if you're not using an industry expert professional. And so the issue with that is you may be under the false belief that you have equity of 2 or 3 million within your business, when actually, if a buyer does proper due diligence on that business, you may get a rude awakening that actually what you thought was 2 million may be 250,000. And so there is no substitute for that expertise. And the earlier you have access to that, the better you can prepare and the longer runway you have when it comes to selling and selling for an optimum price. And so let's talk price. What's my practice worth?
All right. Well, there are a few factors that influence the value of the practice and what you might be paid. One thing I want to be clear here, whilst we serve private general practice owners, we don't work for not-for-profits, we don't help corporates, any of that. I'm actually okay, whoever you choose to sell your practice to, because I think at the end it is your job to extract the most value for you. And in regard to what happens on the other side, if people are selling to corporates, well, GPs need to set up more clinics. It's as simple as that. And having GP run clinics, I think, is better for the community. The problem is once they get above a certain size, it's much harder to find people that have the money to buy those GP clinics. That becomes the challenge. So the factors that determine the price section, the quality of the practice, and the quality is not so easily defined, but I think people that are buying clinics can very readily determine a good quality practice. Heaps of Google reviews, high quality reviews, been in the area for a long time, has a large patient following, often charging private fees to a relatively large portion of the patient base, very good reputation, been around a long time, respected GPs, that kind of thing. The size of the practice, obviously, or group of practices. I'd rather have less clinics that were bigger than a bunch of clinics that are really small. It's much harder to overcome the basic running costs of those businesses. And then, of course, the profitability of the clinics. And as you alluded to earlier, I mean the real profitability as audited by industry experts, not some profitability inflated by a doctor leaving 100% of their billings in there and drawing out some kind of a salary that makes it look better. So real profitability. The other thing that's going to influence the sale price is the post-purchase owner obligations. And usually the owner would be obliged to stick around for around about 3 years, and there will be heavy restraints on anywhere else or any other type of work that they choose to do. Now, the cool story I'm going to share with you at the end section is the owner actually had no obligation to continue to work in the clinic. That was part of our coaching with their exits, but that's very rare. Most of the time, that doesn't happen. In my case, in practices that I've sold, I've never had the obligation to work in them. That was also because I was accountable for such a small portion of billings, either 0 or 1 to 2% in other cases for those clinics, that it wasn't really an amount that made a big difference to the clinic. The other thing that drives the value of an asset, this is really obvious, but the availability of money. What do I mean by that? Well, there's always contractual phases and expansionary phases with monetary policy, money coming into a sector through private equity or venture capital or other means will drive prices. And, this is something I made a note here, competition. So availability of money and competition. And I don't know how many auctions you've ever been to, but in certain phases of my life, I've been to a few property auctions. And I can tell you my favorite ever competition is middle-aged to older dude with original wife versus the same dude with new wife, like 20 years younger wife. Those two, when they both want the same property, you never seen anything like it. It is absolutely fantastic competition. If you're selling that house, you're going to get 20% above market because neither of them will back down for very different reasons. So this is the same in the sector that we're in. There are waves that go on where they become more and less popular for a variety of reasons. Money moves into a sector, money moves out of a sector. When there are combined factors of money being more available and there are multiple people competing for a scarce group of assets, then you'll find that property prices back on the old versus new, the prices of the businesses will be worth more than what they would be at other times in different cycles. That does vary quite a bit. It's probably something like 20 to 30%, the variation in property valuation. So you could be talking $1 million in that, depending on the appetite. And they're the key things that I think are the drivers of determining price.
Cool. And so I think we've got a whole episode on it. It's called Buying the Wrong Practice Will Break You. So we'll put that in the show notes and the description for this episode. Even if you're a vendor, you should go and listen to that. But in terms of profit, because we touched on that, typically what is profit of a practice?
The profit as in what kind of margins would you expect? Yeah. Okay. So
yeah, or maybe how is it derived? How's the revenue model that leads to profit derived?
Yeah, good question. So just using really straightforward figures, if we catch a practice in the wild, so somebody who hasn't undertaken any active improvement activities, we know that based on gross billings, they typically have a margin of somewhere between 6 and 8%. I've seen the information, the benchmarking data from William Buck, and they had them at around about that. That rings about true. So the portion of gross billings, the profitability in the practice is typically between 6 and 8%. Remember, some clinics, like brand new clinics, will have large overheads relating to fit outs in particular. That means they're making a 10-year commitment to the repayments, etc. But so this is overall 6 to 8% thereabout. In terms of the community that we coach, Sachin, you'll see that the margins on gross billings are more between 10 and 15%. And the highest we've seen is just over 20% of billings for people that run really slick businesses, typically where the property asset is owned by them. And so they've been able to optimize the use of that floor space without any sort of difficulties from a landlord, etc. And so that's typically what it is in terms of what you'd expect on profitability. If you go away and have a look and you find out yours is a lot less, you do need to speak to someone like Sachin or myself would be a good start. And the valuation then of that is usually, I mean, they often use an EBITDA multiple, and EBITDA is earnings before interest, tax, deductions, and amortizations. The last two are really relevant if you have a business that does have some debt, paying off the fit out costs, maybe equipment, maybe office equipment, all of those kind of things. And you just need to make sure that you negotiate well to work out how that's treated in the event as a transaction. Typically, business purchases are debt-free and cash-free. What that means is there are no debt obligations that are transferred to the buyer and any cash left in the business. So most businesses have a float. There's a bit of money left there to make sure that it can account for cash flow timing differences. And so that is normalized out as well. So you get to take the cash out, but you also have to hand the business over debt-free. It's important to recognize that a lot of agreements you have on loans, particularly things like commercial hire purchase, which is the way you would finance the fit out, they often have a penalty payout, which means that say you take a loan out over 10 years, they give you a 2% discount on the payout, which means you're paying 98% of all of the costs that you would pay over the 10 years if you pay it out early. And that's often because those debts have been securitized and so they're not easily broken. Sometimes you've got to find some mechanisms to work around the fact that that's not a good decision to pay out those kind of debts where there really are large penalties associated with them. And then the multiple that's applied, Sachin, is typically between 3 and 5 times. We've found really large and really well-run practices getting into the 6s. That's pretty rare though. And again, those are businesses that are usually well-run. They've been in coaching environments and high-performance environments with people around them that just know how to do all the things well.
Awesome. And I know you're going to tell us one of your favorite stories in a minute of someone who's been through the sale process. I think the other thing I wanted again to highlight, I've got an agenda here, haven't I, is that when we say gross billings, when you're talking about profit calculations, you as vendors, it's going to be mainly vendors listening and watching this, that only includes the service fee proportion or the equivalent of the service fee proportion of your billings that are generated. You may, if you haven't received the relevant expert advice, you may be thinking that the profit of your practice is higher than it actually is if 100% of your billings is included in the profit calculation. And that is where you can be led to have a false belief or understanding of the true value of your practice. And so, any comments on that, Todd?
Yeah, so the gross billing figure, I find the easiest to work on, but as you say, there are factors that may be outside of this. I think if you want to know what the value of your business is, those two accounting firms that I talked about, I know will give you a business valuation for somewhere between $5,000 and $7,000, maybe $8,000, depending on the complexity and size of your practice. So if you ever think, gee, I wonder what my clinic's worth, you can find out. And the quality of the valuation done by either of those two organizations is sufficient for bank valuation purposes. So it's of a high quality. And then that can be something that helps you to make some decisions around how you drive higher value as well. And again, if you're motivated to drive value and you're ambitious, Satch and I aren't interested in working people that have low motivation and low ambition. But if you are ambitious, and I'm going to give you the story, which we'll talk to you about why you should definitely be ambitious, then come and ask for some assistance with this. We live, eat, and breathe this every day, and so Satch and I was trying to work out how many people we've helped with this, but it's my count is 350 odd owners or ownership groups, which probably represents around about 500 practices that we've done this with, as well as our own. And so it's a large cohort that we're speaking for. I'm going to be bold and say no one else in Australia has done this, and certainly not GPs and owners. It may be that you've had business people that have transacted these, business brokers, but again, they're not doing the work in elevating the performance of the business to get it ready for sale. They're not the ones that have coached people through purchase agreements, sale of business agreements. They're the ones that are working for transactions. And so, again, important people and good people doing the work. You mentioned one earlier in Larry, who's been around for a bit. These are good people doing good work. But in terms of the reality of getting you from where you are to where you want to be, I don't think there's anybody else that does it.
Yeah, there'll be people listening or watching this thinking, maybe I'm late in my journey. It's too late. I'll just leave it to someone else. And we talked earlier about giving yourself an 18 to 24 month window at least to do this work. Have you got any examples you want to share of when this is done well and goes right?
Yeah. Before I do, there's actually 3 people I want to give a shout out to that are in our community at ages 69, 70, and 72 that are owners that are receiving coaching. So I think the lifelong learner part, the question around when is too late to begin, there are actually people who say, you know what, I don't think it's ever too late, and I'm motivated to collect on what is due me because I've missed that opportunity prior to now. I really admire and respect those people. Some of my favorite people to work with. One person like this comes to mind. In my mind, she's the queen of GP ownership. The reason I call her a queen is she's done some really high profile work in representative organizations and just put forward the case for general practice ownership, and will have been one of the first female owners probably in that space. When she took that on, that was pretty rare. And so I think that's actually really cool to demonstrate. And what you're seeing now is there are more women in ownership. In fact, we coach more women in Project X than we do men as owners. I won't get into the reasons why that is, but it's probably that they are more coachable. They don't think that, which is more broadly, men tend to be overconfident in their knowledge and their ability to execute. And so this person, the queen of ownership, had owned her practice between 2 and 3 decades, 2 practices in a triple M1 area. We worked with her from December to December, 2 years exactly, which is pretty cool. She was in Project X, and then she was in Boardroom, a little space on top of Project X. We've just got a little bit deeper on leadership and delegation and mindset, as well as intergenerational wealth creation. In those 2 years, she actually had a valuation done at the start, so we knew exactly what the business was worth. And then she sold the business, and we know exactly what she sold it for. So it was 2 clinics that had a profit of around about 800K. They were valued at 4 times profit, and so 3.2 million was the business value. Her objective was to bolster that because she was closer to retirement than not. As I mentioned earlier, she was able to execute the transaction without a personal obligation to continue to work. Of course, she would have restraints, as you'd expect it to say, you can't work in this area for a period of 3 to 5 years, which is fine if you're planning on winding down anyway. And what happened over the 2 years, and she did all of the things that I just talked through, including at these 2 locations, making some improvements at the physical locations, but absolutely nailed the actions, just knew exactly what was required and did the next action at the right time. Incredibly accountable, and somebody who built a really highly aligned team that was able to deliver on what she wanted. And the figure at the end of 2 years was 10.3 mil. So I'm going to say that again, because a lot of people are going to think that's wrong. But in 2 years, this person turned 2 to 3 decades of work. 3.2 mil is not a bad return for 2 to 3 decades. We're going to say it's not great. If for the extra time, risk, stress, sacrificed holidays, sacrificed stress, cognitive bandwidth, all the things that go with owning a business, probably could have done better by just investing in the share market, is what I would guess. getting to 10 and a bit is unbelievable. And that's a life-changing amount of money. And that is the appropriate return that that person deserved for their contribution to general practice and their own community with the businesses that they built in that time and how well they serve their community. I just love that. I think that is the best example of somebody that has just got to doing the work and in exactly 2 years. So imagine if you had sold that for 3.2 and the next person turned it from 3.2 to 10.3 in 2 years, which is something that a lot of the people in Project X are looking for, people that have those businesses at 3.2 so they can turn them into that. But owning it and doing it yourself is pretty cool.
Excellent. That is a great way to finish. Today we've covered how exactly to go about the thought process when it comes to selling your practice. The next episode that we will record together, Todd, will be when I've decided and I'm ready, how do I actually do the mechanics of the sale? So that'll be coming up in future. Remember, we referred to another episode called Buying the Wrong Practice Will Break You, because that goes into detail about the mechanics of valuation. We'll see you next time. Thank you, Todd.
Thanks, Ashton. Bye.